Bibliophiles of the internet, I realize that we're almost into August at this point, but even though we're well past the midpoint of the year, I would still love to reflect on my reading in the first half of 2026. So I'm going to do a little spin on the mid-year check-in tag. Kind of like last year, I've compiled a handful of mid-year questions from a few different sources. Some are from the original tag, some are taken from the mid-year calm down tag created by Leandra the TBR0, and some are questions of my own creation that sort of split the difference between the two. So anyone who needs crediting will be credited down below, but let's jump into the very first question, which is how has your reading year gone so far? I should clarify that all of my answers will be based on the reading I did in the first half of 2026, so through the end of June, even though, again, we're almost into August at this point. But I'm super happy with the reading I was able to do in the first half of the year. As an extremely eclectic reader who always reads a very wide variety of things, I feel like I've done a good job of balancing a lot of different genres and formats. As a chronic mood reader, I've also left myself a lot more space to read things spontaneously or on a whim, which has led to discovering a lot of very pleasant surprises. Reading diversely is something very naturally ingrained in what I choose to read and review as well, so I feel like I've been exposed to a lot of different worlds and realities and experiences. Statistically speaking, I think I've also read more classics in the last 6 to 8 months than I have in perhaps decades, which is kind of wild to think about. I don't necessarily think that indicates a shift in my reading taste or the solidification of a new reading habit, but it is interesting to note. Giving myself credit where credit is due, I also feel like I've struck a pretty good balance between reading new releases for review, but also reading backlist releases that I've been wanting to get to for quite some time. So overall, I'm very happy with what I was able to read in the first half of 2026. Question number 2, what is the best book you've read so far in 2026? This is such a hard question, but I think I have to give it to The Last Best Quest Ever by F.T. Lukens. Full disclosure, this answer could have easily been Espiritu, but I get to gush about that shortly in a different question, so for the sake of variety, and also just based on its own merits, I want to show some love for this most recent F.T. Lukens release. Very quickly, for those who may not know, this is a super zany YA fantasy adventure story about Eleanor, who is the most renowned hero and adventurer in the entire kingdom, but the problem is that her entire legacy is built on lies. Before she can get caught up in those lies, she decides to announce her retirement at the next royal feast, but she quickly has to backtrack that announcement when her twin brother Zig bets a pair of mages that Eleanor can track down the mythical elder beast, the most elusive creature that has never before been found. There's so much more to it than that, but that's basically what it is in a nutshell, and I loved it so much because it not only once again allows F.T. Lukens' trademark humor and infectious sense of whimsy to really shine through, but it also has incredibly powerful themes about how we are conditioned to not give ourselves credit for all the things we do if we don't do them the hard way. It's about how it's easy to tell ourselves that if we don't suffer, if we don't struggle, then whatever we accomplish doesn't count, when that couldn't be further from the truth. The story is about how you don't get some special trophy for struggling through something. If doing things the hard way and doing things the so-called easy way ultimately gets you to the same end result, why would you choose to make things harder for yourself when just existing in this world is already hard enough as it is? I think especially for young readers, that's a really important message, and I really appreciate the story for being willing to have those conversations. Question number 3, what is the best sequel you've read so far in 2026? I think you know my answer. Without question, the best sequel I've read so far is Espiritu by Aidan Thomas, which comes out relatively soon in early September. I had the joy and privilege of reading it in early January, and I honestly have not stopped thinking about it since. This is obviously the long-awaited sequel to Cemetery Boys, one of the best books, period, in my very humble, very biased opinion, but not only is this book a triumph based on its own merits, but as a follow-up to an incredibly beloved book that already has so much to offer, it's also an absolute triumph in that sense. It's introducing new and really exciting elements to the Cemetery Boys universe. It's expanding on the world and magic system and character ecosystem established in the first book in a way that's both compelling and effective. It gives secondary characters space to really shine and bring things to the table that we didn't get a chance to see in book 1. And it's also able to balance a dual POV structure without compromising or decentering either main character's voice. There's so much more I could say about this, but needless to say, I loved every single second I spent with this sequel, and I cannot wait for even more people to experience it themselves. Question number 4, what's a book you read in the first half of 2026 that evoked a powerful response? Besides Espiritu and The Last Best Quest Ever, which I've already given their flowers, I think I would have to say This Wretched Beauty by Elle Grenier, which I went into with really high expectations as an explicitly queer and trans femme non-binary retelling of Dorian Gray, and yet it still somehow exceeded all of those expectations. It takes the horror and self-obsession of the original text and turns it into an intrinsically and unmistakably trans experience. The story shows how Dorian's obsession with their own magically unchanging portrait stems from feeling suffocated by a world that expects them to grow into a man and to take on the mantle of manhood in these very clear-cut, concrete ways that ultimately don't reflect their true feelings or their experience of self. That's a very painful thing to grapple with, the reality that you're being forced to grow into someone that you fundamentally cannot recognize. And the story is exploring how hopeless the future can feel when we don't have the vocabulary or imagination to create a reality where we can just exist as ourselves, as opposed to being forced to mold ourselves into an imagined ideal that we can never possibly hope to actually embody or recreate. I really appreciate this retelling for not shying away from those dark, complex, painful realities, but also for allowing its trans femme non-binary hero to work their way through those issues and come through on the other side. It's a really evocative, incredible, worthwhile retelling that really hit home for me in so many ways. Question number 5. What's a new release from the first half of the year that you haven't read yet, but want to? Going off of recent releases that were published in the first half of 2026, I think there were 2 big sci-fi releases that gave me a little bit of FOMO. The first and most egregious miss on my part is Ann Leckie's new book, Radiant Star, which came out on May 12th from Orbit. In my defense, while I was incredibly fortunate to receive a galley of this book, it did not show up on my doorstep until release day, so it kind of got lost in the shuffle. But I have not forgotten about it. I have read and loved pretty much everything Ann Leckie has written in this sci-fi universe, and I don't expect this new edition to be any different. I'm also constantly thinking about another recent Orbit release that was and still is one of my most anticipated releases of 2026. That is The Republic of Memory by Mahmoud El Sayed, which also came out in early May. This sounds like a really cool Arab futurist take on a generation ship story. It's set on a generation ship that's halfway through its 400-year voyage, but instead of focusing on the ancestors being preserved in cryostasis, it's following the ship's crew who are taking care of those ancestors generation after generation. And it's supposed to explore that tension of how this crew is essentially giving up their lives for a people and a planet that they will never actually get to experience themselves, which I think is an incredibly fascinating concept. Question number 6. What is your most anticipated book release for the second half of the year? I have quite a few, so I'm going to rapid fire through a handful of choices. Obviously, Andrew Joseph White has a new YA book coming out later this year. Julian Winters has his first YA contemporary fantasy book coming out next month. Janae Marks has a new middle grade book coming out in October that I cannot wait to fall in love with. Isabel Cañas has her debut YA horror book coming out at the end of September. We get a new adult sci-fi from Yoon-Ha Lee this fall that I am foaming at the mouth over. We also get a new Micaiah Johnson this year, and it's her take on a haunted house story, which I am super psyched to read. Again, that's just to name a few, but there's definitely a lot to still look forward to in 2026. Question number 7. What's a book you read in the first half of 2026 that you really needed? Just for the record, I could reuse any of the titles I've already mentioned for so many of these questions, but I'm consciously trying not to repeat myself, so I think I'm actually going to go with the series I picked up spontaneously on the very last day of June, which was, of course, the I Wanna Be a Wall manga series. This is a short and sweet little series that's basically a modern queer spin on a marriage of convenience. It's about an asexual, aromantic otaku named Yuriko who's obsessed with all things BL, and a closeted gay man named Gakurota who has a hopeless, unrequited crush on his straight childhood best friend. The two of them meet during a matchmaking session and decide to marry each other when they realize a romance would be virtually impossible between them. So it's basically a slice of life series following them as they try to figure out what a shared life actually looks like for them, while also grappling with all the outside expectations that come with married life. I really adored and appreciated this series for what it is. You can't go into it expecting like a critical deconstruction of BL fandom and otaku life, or a critique of the systemic homophobia that still runs rampant in Japanese culture. It's not aiming to address those things. It's a quiet, soft, domestic story about two people who have willingly chosen to be each other's life partners, to be each other's family, and that's something that they both take very seriously. And it's just about how they really want to be good partners for each other and show the other person that they're loved loved and respected, even if romance never factors into that equation. And I say that this was a series I really needed to read because the underlying message of the series really hit me square in the heart. It's a really beautiful testament to how we don't have to fully understand each other or share the same interests, the same values in order to care about someone deeply or to show up for each other in meaningful ways. And that's something I needed to hear. Question number 8. What's a book that really energized you? For sure, that would be Blood in the Machine by Brian Merchant. This is a nonfiction history book following the first anti-machine revolution in the 19th century organized by the Luddites, who took up arms against the industrialists striving to automate their work. So it's about that specific piece of history, but the book is also taking a much broader look at how our ongoing class wars are part of a very long and storied legacy stemming from the Luddite revolution, and what that can teach us about how tech companies are continuing to prioritize automation and so-called efficiency over human labor and human well-being as we live through what's known as the second machine age. This was a really energizing book for me because I think it very clearly and effectively makes a case for how so many of the tech-related issues we're contending with today are issues that humankind has faced and successfully fought back against in centuries past, and that there's so much that history can still teach us. Like I said in my April wrap-up, there's something strangely comforting about seeing how the struggle to hold on to our collective humanity has long been the concern of free-thinking humans everywhere across geographies, centuries, and generations, and how even though technology has changed so much, we are still not helpless in that ongoing fight. Question number 9. Which book has brought you the most joy so far in 2026? I think as a whole, and again, previous titles I mentioned notwithstanding, I have to give this to Katie Casey's Unwritten Rules series. This was a series I picked up on a complete whim. I didn't know what to expect. The covers are not great, which I'm absolutely not denying, but this turned out to be such a brilliant, beautiful, joyful romance series. Not only does Katie Casey effortlessly balance sports content, character growth, and romance development, but each pairing in this companion series is comprised of deeply flawed characters who are ultimately learning how to be vulnerable even when it's scary, and how to open themselves up to receiving love. I have such a deep respect for how all the couples in their own way are learning to push back against the instinct that they don't deserve love just because they're not perfect, when ultimately that couldn't be further from the truth. And it's really powerful and also really joyful to see them working through those emotional roadblocks and forming deeply meaningful relationships. Honestly, if you're a fan of sports romances, I think these are 3 of the best out there, and I would highly recommend the entire series. Question number 10. Who is your favorite new author you've discovered in 2026? Truthfully, there are a lot of different ways I could answer this question. I did just show some love for Katie Casey, so I'll give her another honorable mention here. I really loved the blend of whimsy and heartfelt storytelling that I found in Sarah Swift's debut, Kill the Beast, and it's made me really excited to check out her next book. I also read from Kylie Lee Baker for the first time in March, and it only made me even more excited to read her latest release, Japanese Gothic. Hiran Enz and Vaja Chandrasekhara are 2 of the most interesting minds I read from in the first half of the year. I am very intrigued to see what else they can possibly imagine. And lastly, I think I want to show some love for Caitlin Rozakis, who I also just read from for the first time. She has a really zany, entertaining, over-the-top kind of humor and style that I really vibe with, and since I already own 2 of her other books, I feel really confident that I'm going to enjoy more of her work. And the last question for today, question 11, what is one book you would like to read by the end of the year, new release or not? I have one short-term series goal that I'm really focused on for the moment before I allow myself to start any new series. I am, of course, talking about the Nameless Republic trilogy from Suyi Davies Okumbowa. I read the first book last month, and the 3rd and final book comes out in August, so if I stay locked in, I could finish that sooner rather than later. Not to say too much, but I'm also having a very Emily Wilson forward 2026, and I know she recently published a nonfiction book about how translators approach translating ancient texts. It's called Crossing the Wine Dark Sea, and I would very much like to read that before the end of 2026, among so many other things. So there you have it. Those are my reflections on the first half of my reading year, as well as a pretty good amount of gushing over some of my favorite books that I've read so far, although there are many more, I will say. If you have any answers to these questions that you would like to share, or if you want to shout out your favorite books that you read in the first half of 2026, I would love to hear all about that down below in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page. Bye!